Hello, and welcome to our online lecture. I hope you all are safe, healthy, and well, and coping as well as you can under our extraordinary circumstances. It is my absolute pleasure to talk to you today about the turbulent 1850s, or the era before the American Civil War over slavery. And many of the themes that we talk about today are familiar and you have heard before, such as the issue of expansion, race and freedom, and the specific laws that govern who is considered a citizen and who is not in the newly discovered republic. Remember, we're working our way up to 1860, as 1860 is the beginning of, or officially the beginning of, the American Civil War over slavery. So the decade before this beginning of the Civil War really is considered to be the tumultuous 1850s for a number of reasons. And we're going to spend our time today really looking at all of the various parts of the era before Civil War breaks out to try to demonstrate that when war occurs, it does not occur out of nowhere. There are numerous signs basically revealing the level of discord going on in any historical example. And in the example of the United States in the 1850s, this is a time where America is coming apart at the seams. And the reason for this disintegration was slavery. Can slavery coexist in a place that builds itself as a beacon of democracy? Can slavery coexist with people in terms of participation in government, participation in economics? There are a lot of social changes that are happening in the beginning of the 19th century due to the beginning of industrialization. We also see a larger symphony of voices about abolition, and we'll start here. Abolition, of course, is the movement to end enslavement. It was a movement that was going on across the Atlantic world. So we would find abolitionists in the United States, other parts of the Western Hemisphere, particularly the Caribbean and South America, anywhere that had race based slavery. We would also find abolitionists in England and other parts of Western Europe, which also participated in enslavement, and voices from sub-Saharan Africa. So the abolitionist movement, at least in terms of the 1850s, is becoming a much more popular mainstream movement, and less a once thought of as a radical notion. And there are a couple of both key political and cultural factors that are making it more mainstream. One is key political developments. There is a new political organization in the United States that is forming that sees abolition and the end of enslavement as key to American democracy. And that group is the Republican Party. The Republicans really raised the issue of violence that's being done on abolitionists. They raised the issue that Southern slave owners are paying for abolitionists to be killed, are basically creating conditions that will lead to further generations of enslavement. So, interestingly enough, the Republicans are really suggesting in the 1850s that slavery cannot continue, as it is a threat to democracy. Now, they're coming at this from the perspective of what was known as the Free Soil Movement. And the Free Soil Movement was critical of enslavement, not because they saw anything wrong with it in terms of race, but they saw it as a threat to small farmers. So there is a group of white Americans, farmers, who are becoming voices to end slavery. And again, they're not doing it out of a belief that slavery is wrong. They're coming at it more as it threatens their own ability to be independent farmers. Now, in terms of the Civil War and westward expansion, as new territories come up for statehood, the key question is, will this state be allowed to be a slave state or a free state? Obviously, central to that is who has more power in Congress. If you remember the Compromise of 1850, this was based on the idea that after the Mexican American War, right, in which all you see in this orange part as well as the yellow California, all of this used to be Mexico. So after the U.S. wins this war with Mexico and we have a third of our territory, the question is going to be, will these new places be allowed to have enslavement or not? With California, California is seeing a increased population due to the gold rush, similar to what happened in Georgia in the 1830s. Um, there is also a interesting immigrant population of Asians beginning to emerge in the 1850s along the West Coast. Many who are coming or relocating to the United States to find work, and they're going to along the railroad. Texas, this very large, vast amount of Texas, is going to be entered as a slave-holding state. We know this because slavery and allowing slavery in Texas was one of the reasons for the Mexican American War. So the critical issue is California, this part. Will these territories be allowed to be enslaved or not? So the compromise in this is going to be fierce. So what comes out of the Compromise of 1850? DC, right, will have no slave trade. No slave trade in DC. California, will be admitted as a non-slave holding state. These two territories, that will become the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, slavery will be determined by popular sovereignty, meaning the people of those territories would decide whether or not enslavement would be allowed. And in order to get to this agreement or compromise, a number of things had to happen. And there were a series of bills that were produced by both Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay. Texas gives up lands. It gets tens of millions of dollars. Southwestern territories, as I said before, are organized without basically slavery. But the real gift to slaveholders comes with the Fugitive Slave Act, which meant that any free person of color that is found in the American South or across the United States could be sold back into slavery. Now, this is a critical moment in American history because with the Fugitive Slave Act, it is basically deputizing any white person can make money off of selling any person of color. This is going to include, of course, men and women who were born in other parts of the United States, not in the South, who will be brought into enslavement through the Fugitive Slave Act. It also allows for slave owners to physically hunt those enslaved people who have successfully escaped. And we know there are large free communities across the American South. Augusta is one of them, the Spring Hill community, where we would find free people of color. So free people of color, as we've already seen, their numbers are increasing across the South. Communities are becoming larger. And yet at the same time, these new powerful political and and legal mechanisms are put in place to try to restrict this. So again, a number of factors are working at the same time. Um, the most significant part, in my estimation, of this compromise of 1850 is, of course, the Fugitive Slave Act. It was also considered to be the most controversial part. There is no jury trial, according to this federal act, for fugitives. So, again, if you have seen or read the book 12 Years a Slave, it speaks of this, the power of this act in legally not giving the person a right to demonstrate his or her freedom or acknowledging that a person of color could be free. And that's that legal decision that's coming. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Um, Citizens are required to assist in recovering of slaves, right? So again, this is the deputizing of ordinary folks, ordinary white people, to make a money or make a commission off of selling and finding, hunting, retrieving people of color in the United States. The impacts of the Fugitive Slave Act are immense, as one can imagine, including people fleeing other countries in order to get away from the lack of freedom in the United States, particularly places like Canada. As I mentioned before, kidnapping of people is quite common. So there are, as we've certainly mentioned, free communities across the United States. There are free communities in the American South. That means that those individuals living there, whether it's Boston or Springfield, Georgia, are in fear of their lives. As if one is kidnapped and sold into slavery, there are no legal mechanisms to get out. As and I think the advertisement is worth mentioning and reading out loud. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with the watchmen and the police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. To go on, and they have already been actually employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds on the tracks of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have top eye open. April 24th, 1851. Now, I just have to stop and comment on just how chilling this is. It also shows a very close cooperation, obviously, between the police of Boston, the power structure of Massachusetts, and slave owners in the American South. The Watchmen, of course, this is a very interesting reference if you've watched any of the HBO show or read the comics. Um, this this is very interesting terminology that is being used, and also shows the historical power behind this idea of watchmen. Um, so this gives you an idea of how this is going to be put into practice, how this really shapes life in the United States in the 1850s. And with this becoming legal, as you can imagine, this really amplifies abolitionists. There is a massive outcry within the abolitionist community against this Fugitive Slave Act. And in many ways, this is one of the causes of the American Civil War. Excuse me. In Kansas and Nebraska, and that's the unorganized territory right here, as you can see, the issue of enslavement is also a bringing about a political crisis in this part of the country, specifically Kansas and Nebraska, which are um, farming communities, basically individual farmers. The fear from individual farmers white farmers is if it becomes legal to have enslaved labor throughout Kansas and Nebraska, there's no way that individual farmers will be able to exist. It will be a monopoly of wealthy slave owning plantations. Um, so there is a movement of who are known as the free soilers. We talked about that earlier in the lecture, in both Kansas and Nebraska. People there really are hoping that they can answer this question for themselves and decide without the federal government stepping in. Stephen Douglas, who's pictured here, is one of the senators from this part of the country, and he wants to really have the people basically decide for themselves um, what to do. The issue of enslavement is also bringing about actual military blows in Kansas. Um, there are, again, those who want Kansas to decide. There are those who want um, um, uh, abolition. There's a large abolitionist community there, and the two sides come to physical, almost military blows. This is known as Bleeding Kansas. A mini civil war breaks out in Kansas over the question of enslavement. And there are basically two governments attempting to run Kansas at the same time, one advocating for enslavement, one advocating for abolition. So it's interesting to look at the country, as we often talk about the American Civil War, obviously between North and South. But when we break down the 1850s, right, looking at if California is going to have enslavement, these territories, how it's affecting this part of the country, this issue of freedom and race determining who's free and unfree is causing problems across the country. It's not just an issue of the South. This is a issue felt across the map. And politically, um, the emotions and tension that enslavement is causing in the nation is actually coming to physical blows, not only in the Midwest, but also on the Senate floor. In the summer of 1859, two senators are involved in a physical altercation over enslavement. What you have here is Charles Sumner, who is featured here, was a senator from Massachusetts. He is going to be what is known eventually as a radical Republican. He is an abolitionist, and he gets up and gives a very impassioned speech about the South and its slave society, and how it is basically criminal acts that are being done in the name of this peculiar institution. In response to this, a senator from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, who was seen here with his cane, gets up and beats him with his cane on the floor of the Senate. And as you can imagine, the regions respond very differently. Massachusetts in the north see this as an act of Southern aggression and violence. The Southerners claim that they are defending their honor. And so you can see how this is this tension is being felt in every aspect of the American experience. In 1856, there is the nomination of John C. Fremont. Um, Fremont was very much a celebrity. There have been those who have argued that John C. Fremont is one of the first American political celebrities, and he and his wife had become quite famous because of sort of adventures in the West and writing about the West and helping to create American mythology about the West. His wife was very much the mastermind behind the creation of John Fremont's political persona. And they are basically celebrities. John Fremont is also creating a space that is antagonistic of racial divisions and is helping to sort of fuel the flames, as it were, in the 1850s. But more than anything else, more than the creation of sort of national white supremacy through John C. Fremont, or the caning of Charles Sumner on the congressional floor, or the brawls in Kansas, no other event comes close to having the kind of toll as the Dred Scott decision of 1857. Um, if you are unfamiliar with the story of Dred Scott, you should take some time and really delve in, as it is a such an interesting moment in American history. I'm going to give you just a brief synopsis of events, but it's very much worth your time to really look at both the man behind the Dred Scott decision of 1857, as well as um, Homer Plessy, the man behind the Plessy versus Ferguson, decision of 1898. In this case, Dred Scott is born enslaved and yet taken to free territories, Illinois and eventually Wisconsin, um, in a tradition that you are aware of. Also, looking back from those women who successfully did this in the early 19th century, he sued for his freedom in a non slave holding state. Um, the case is first heard in 1846 and then eventually finds its way to the Supreme Court in 1857. And what comes out from the Supreme Court is that Scott, nor any people of color, are actually free in the United States. That anyone, regardless of free or non holding free state, people of color are not guaranteed citizenship rights, are not citizens. Um, and it's very much in line with the Fugitive Slave Act. But this ruling, right, from the Supreme Court shows us a couple of things. First and foremost, the Supreme Court tends to act highly conservatively. It has been characterized as some sort of bastion of liberal policy, and that's just not the case in American history. Typically, the Supreme Court is decades behind where American people are in terms of their ideas of the practice of democracy. Second, the Dred Scott decision demonstrated to abolitionists that they were actually fighting a very different battle, that there are no colored citizens of any kind in the United States, and that perhaps tactics needed to change, that those who were advocating perhaps for nonviolent approaches, those voices are now muffled by those who believed that only a radical insurrection would fundamentally change the United States. So this ruling very much has a powerful impact on abolitionists. And one of the ways you can measure this is by looking at John Brown's raid on Harper Ferry. John Brown, again, is a white Kansan um, who was highly devoted to his religious practices. He is the father of many children. He's a farmer. He's very religious. He loses a lot of children, just like many did at that point in time. Um, and he comes to believe that God's purpose for himself is to lead um, um, people out of slavery, as the story had been written biblically. So John Brown is going to create basically a posse of abolitionists. Some are white, some are black, and their goal is simple. They want to raid a federal arsenal in Virginia in Harper's Ferry. It had a bunch of weapons. They were going to raid that. They were going to distribute the weapons to people, to those who are enslaved and those who would join them, and basically um, blow their way out of it. John Brown is not successful in doing this. He's captured. He is eventually hung for his involvement in what is considered a conspiracy treason against the United States. But happens right before the start of the American Civil War. The election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln of this newly created Republican Party is elected. The South, he gets no votes from any Southern state. The South then takes his election as their moment to secede, where they then create an entirely new country called the Confederate States of America, intent on maintaining race based slavery. So this is a pivotal moment. But as I mentioned, um, we have to sort of break down all of the aspects of what's happening well before war is actually declared. And I think this is gives us a multi-layer look of really what's happening at this moment right before the Civil War is going to begin. We could also look at our own time to see how these political divisions, the use of media, the role of sort of emotional um, rhetoric, as well as the visible issues of inequality, are creating conditions where Americans are willing to go to war with one another. And at our political moment, we would have to look at the last 20 years, potentially leading to a crisis in America. Our contemporary crisis did not occur overnight. It has been the culmination of, at this point, nearly 45 years of political choices and policy. So when we think about what's happening in our own time, it helps to have history to break down different facets to show um, how, again, history is made by individual actors, policy, and um, and decisions. Things are not preordained, they are not predecided. So take some time, look over this, and I look forward to reading your discussions this week. Let me know if you have any questions, issues, or concerns. Thank you. It's been my pleasure.